Hi, and welcome back to Elle's Cozy Book Corner, where I've been reading The Vampires Next Door, one chapter at a time. Today, we're going to read Chapter 3. Alison. A quiet, rhythmic knocking stirred Alison from her sleep. Her mind floated several moments in the in-between before her brain registered the knocking was someone at her front door. She bounded off her bed, pushing her purple feather comforter aside, and rushed to the door before the racket woke her sleeping mother. Worried it might be her horrible neighbor, she peered through the peephole. OMG, it's Rodham. She raked her hand through her knotted hair and swallowed, getting a gulp of morning breath. Forgetting about her sleeping mom, and more worried over Rodham seeing her ragged morning state, she scurried to the hall bath, splashed water over her face, ran a comb through her gnarled hair, and gargled with blistering. She glanced at her pajamas and considered changing clothes. Then the knocking stopped. By the time she opened the door, Rodham stood closer to his door than hers. The quiet creak of her door caught Rodham's attention. He tilted his head, then turned on his heels and walked towards her. Allison's heart pattered at a quickening pace at the prospect of actually talking to him. Hi, I'm Rodham. Your neighbor across the hall. The deep tone of his voice played a melody in her ears. After untying the nervous knots in her tongue, she squeaked, Allison! Dork alert! He scrunched his eyebrows, his forehead forming a slight valley. Allison, would you like to meet me for a smoothie in an hour? A date? He asked me out? She took a deep breath and thought carefully about her response. Yes. Her head bobbed up and down as the words spilled from her lips. Cool. Did I wake you? Because Tinkerbell has water puddling on her head. Did he just say that? She glanced at her top. Tinkerbell's head was on her chest. Allison's face turned 30 shades of red, each one brighter than the next. Embarrassed, her first reaction was to slam the door, run to her bed, whip the covers over her head, and not move for a week. She couldn't do that. Her eyes shifted towards the ground, where shards of glass littered the cement, catching the sun's rays, and light filtered through the open top of the breezeway. She searched her brain for a silly comeback so he'd think she was cool. But darned, her mind went blank. She nodded. He smiled. A dimple poked his straight cheek. She closed the door and burst into the bathroom. Tinkerbell's head was soaked and hid nothing. Her budding nipples poked through like headlights. The thought of curling up in her bed for a week still tarried on her mind. She was indeed a wimp, but one with a date. She rushed into and out of the shower, flipped through the clothes in her closet, searching for something sexy. All she owned was t-shirts, jeans, and sweaters. Like I'd need sweaters in Florida. Might as well donate those to the needy teens in Wisconsin. Disappointed, she settled for a pair of denim shorts, a plain pink t-shirt, and flip-flops. She tiptoed past her sleeping, snoring mother into the master bath and sifted through her lipsticks, holding each one to her lips, looking for the perfect color, then tried on the red. Ugh, too bright. She wiped it off and smeared on the frost pink, squished her lips together, bit down on toilet paper, and puckered, mimicking her mother. She settled on the frost pink. Against her ghostly white skin, it brought out her amber eyes and the red highlights in her ginger hair. There was a smoothie shop in the strip mall beside the apartment complex. She guessed that's the one he meant. All she was going to do was embarrass herself further by knocking on his door to ask. She stepped into the bright afternoon light, shoved a pair of bug-eyed sunglasses over her eyes to avoid the blinding sun, and jumped into her car. A royal blue Chrysler 300 with gold pimp rims parked in the corner of the lot caught her eye. She'd never noticed it before. It must be the neighbors. She started the engine, wiped the sweat crawling from her forehead, and blasted the air. After the approximate 10-minute wait, the steering wheel was cool enough to touch and drive the car without third-degree burns. Rodham's emerald green Charger was parked outside the smoothie shop. A ding resonated in the air as she pushed open the door at Smoothie Fresh. He turned his head and motioned for her to join him. Butterflies did skydives in her belly. Fear gripped her head, and she hyperventilated for a second before gathering her courage. Breathe. Walk slowly. With careful steps, She stumbled towards him. The room grew smaller with each step until his 6-foot sitting form loomed in front of her. She dropped onto the seat opposite him at the table, the butterflies flapping against her insides. Breathe. I made it. Are you okay? His voice stressed with concern. She nodded a yes. His eyes shifted and the valley in his forehead returned. What would you like? You. And not to be a scaredy cat. Like to drink? Her amber eyes shifted to the menu boards behind the counter, scanning the smoothie list. Strawberry delight, she said in a barely audible voice. He nodded and strolled towards the bar, the muscles on his legs dancing with each step. She couldn't take her eyes off him as he ordered. The young woman behind the counter wore her blonde hair in a French braid that lay firm against her back. Her navy eyes fastened on Rodham, only removing them when she fixed their drinks. Stabs of the green jealousy monster thrust into Allison's heart. Her first date, and already someone was flirting with him. She pushed her feelings aside, as she had no claim to him, and he clearly wasn't flirting back. Returning, he placed the smoothie on the faux wooden table in front of her and slid into the opposite seat. Thanks, she muttered. One eyebrow lifted above the other. He said, in a questioning tone, You don't say much. I'm new. She slapped herself mentally for her dorky response. I know. I remember I live across the hall. Never saw you in school before either. Where'd you move from? She forced her brain and mouth to work together again, afraid her 1 or 2 word answers would make the first date her last. I lived in Virginia. So what brought you here? Her mind drifted home to the green-covered mountains and flowing streams with year-round chilly water. My parents' divorce and my mother's new job. He nodded. I lived here most of my life. I know everyone at school. I'll introduce you. Home in Virginia faded at the idea. Maybe she'd have friends, and Florida wouldn't be so bad after all. His small talk helped her body ease. Thanks. That'd be cool. She sipped at her smoothie, a chunk of fruit getting stuck in the straw. He twisted in his seat. I asked you here because... Oh no, this is it. He isn't interested in me. False alarm, she thought. The neighbors across from me. There's something, I don't know, not normal about them, besides the music and parties. Tipping her straw upside down, she tapped it against the table to loosen the fruit chunk. She was sure all the neighbors had noticed the weird women living next door to her and wasn't sure where he was coming from. What do you mean? The fruit chunk drifted towards the opening of the straw as she sucked it out. Rodham's eyes followed her curious movements. Then he pushed his smoothie to the side and leaned across the table closer to her. The smell of his aftershave drifted towards her. Distracted, she struggled to hear his words. Last night, 2 officers showed up. Neither came out. I watched and waited all night. Their curtains were parted, and with the one with the blonde highlights bit the male cop. She bit him. Taken aback by his words, she was confused. The neighbors partied, but biting people seemed over the top, even for them. How do you know she bit him? Maybe she was kissing his neck or giving him a hickey. His eyes turned into chocolate saucers. Hickeys and kisses don't draw blood. It streamed down his neck. She thought for a moment about how they emerged from after sundown and went quiet after sunrise, and the immobilizing cry of terror. A bona fide bookworm. She knew everything about fictional creatures. The blood-sucking fanged creatures that popped into her mind were vampires, and vampires had ultrasonic hearing. A thought bubbled in her brain. 3 nights ago, did you hear that high-pitched shriek? His face stern, he answered, yeah, but my parents sat on the couch watching TV, like oblivious, like they didn't hear it. And the neighbors? They sleep all day. Dead silence. Their eyes locked in a gaze, and their thoughts merged as they spat out simultaneously. Vampires. He leaned back in his seat and blew out a breath of air he'd held in. I'm relieved. I was sure you'd think I was crazy. Vampires next door? She paused for a second. So if they're sucking blood, where's the bodies? Vampires don't eat flesh. OMG. They're turning them. He chuckled. You go from 1-word answers to several sentences. Are you a vampire expert? Yes and no. I read a lot. I mean, a lot. I've read nearly every vampire book ever written. Each author has their own story, but some things are always the same. Vampires suck blood, and on occasion, turn their victims. There are so many ways they do this. Like I said, each author is different. She rambled, aware of it. Most vampires don't want to draw attention to themselves. But ours party. That part doesn't add up. Mesmerized by the movement of her sensuous lips and the intense flame in her eyes, he asked, "Your eyes are on fire. Anyone ever tell you how pretty you are?" She flushed and dropped her eyes towards the table, her pointer finger twirling a loose strand of hair hanging from her ponytail, unsure how to respond. Having her parents and relatives say you're pretty isn't like having the hottest guy on earth say it. And she didn't feel pretty. Never. Thanks. Sensing her uneasiness, he backpedaled to the vampires. If they are what we think, then who says fiction portrays them correctly? Maybe real vampires are hardy partiers. So if they are vampires and they're real, how do we prove it? He lifted his smoothie and took a large gulp. Alison had no idea how to prove it, and the danger terrified her. It's not like either of them could knock on their door and say, "Excuse me, but I saw you bite that cop. Are you vampires?" They become their next meal. Maybe we're wrong, and they're not vampires. She sucked on her smoothie and realized the music was playing, Wildest Dreams by Taylor Swift. If she hadn't been so nervous over meeting Rodham, she'd have noticed earlier. The smoothie shop looked like something from a Disney teen show. Pale colors, chunky pictures, and faux wood tables. So what do we do? I have a plan, but need help implementing it. His eyes narrowed and a devious expression spread across his face. They can't stay in the apartment all the time. Sometime they gotta leave. We go inside. He shifted his back towards the window and set his smoothie down. The drifting sun shone directly on them through the huge glass windows, causing Alison to squint her eyes. Her earlier position blocked the rays. She twisted in her seat away from the sun. And how do we get into their apartment? He slurped down the last of his smoothie, lifted the top, and ate the chunks of fruit at the bottom. With a mouth stuffed with unidentified fruit bits, he said, "We get the key." Could you be more specific? She sucked slowly on her smoothie, lingering over the fruit party happening in her mouth. He leaned towards her, twinkles of emerald light sparkling in his brown eyes. His dimple moved with each word. In 2008, my dad lost his job. We lost our house, and he got a job working at the apartment complex. That's when we moved in. He only worked for them for a year, but that's how I know where they keep the keys. Rodham stood and grabbed a pen from the bar, then sat down next to her. His scent filled his nostrils, a mix of aftershave and him. Delightful. He drew a crude map on the napkin, then pushed it in front of her, using his fingers to direct her eyes. You go into the office here. The resident computers are to the left here. If you go straight through to the office to the back and turn left, the wall is filled with keys to every apartment, and they're labeled by unit number. On Sundays, there's only one person in the office. My plan is to distract her, and I'll snatch the keys. She wasn't sure about the plan. Why me? Alison was much smaller and less noticeable. He, on the other hand, was outgoing, personable, and hot. He'd make a far better distraction, she thought. I'll do the key snatching. No one will notice me. I'm a book nerd wallflower. I'll come in, pretend to use the computers. You do something to gain her attention, and I'll sneak into the back and grab the key. A wall full of keys can't be hard to find. He raised his palm to his chin. Okay, tomorrow's Sunday. We'll do it then. What time? What's your phone number? Her mouth dropped into her lap as the words rolled off his pink tongue. He wants my phone number? Even if it's not because he's madly in love with me, he wants it? Asked for it? She picked her jaw up off her lap and placed it back onto her face while the numbers floated from her mouth. He typed them into his phone and called her. Now you have mine. He smiled as he slipped out of the booth. Rodham. He shuddered at the vision of the vampire across the hall replayed in his mind. He couldn't be sure whether it was real or not, but the vampire's sly gaze through the window implied reality. One way or another, he was going to find out. His plan was to get the cute girl with hair that reminded him of the beach at sunset worked through like a charm. Rodham was more impressed with the inner spark as it ignited when he mentioned his thoughts about their neighbors being vampires. Her fire detonated. She exploded into a vampire book rant. A bookworm explained. All the time she spent glued to her tablet, the intensity and the motion of her soft cherry lips made him long to kiss her. Their plan hatched, and her number in his phone. It was a good day. He wasn't sure he actually believed in the existence of vampires, but the clarity of the visions were like none he'd experienced before. The blood dripping off the fang moved in a slow motion as it fell. Normally he viewed small, fuzzy glimpses, flashes in his visions. Sometimes he heard words in his head, not his own, but never anything that made sense. He heeded their warnings, unknowing if they meant anything. A secret he kept to himself. His parents both at work, Rodham sank into a soft couch and searched for the remote. His hand hit a hard device under a blanket. He removed the layers hiding the device and clicked the power button. The TV screen turned blue for a few seconds, then the cable engaged. Flipping through the channels, a sudden blast of gunfire reverberated through his eardrums. And that is the end for today. Next week I'll read chapter 4. All right, check below for any details about the book. Subscribe and like if this is something you enjoy.